Muted.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Greenhouse Project. We'll be talking about the business case for the Greenhouse model. Before we get started, just two quick announcements. One is I've placed everybody on mute, and that's done for a reason. We've had instances where we've had dogs barking, side conversations, hold music. So we've run into a lot of logistical issues. If you need to ask a question, just use the chat box in the lower right-hand corner, and anything I don't address during the course of the presentation we'll handle at the conclusion during the Q&A period. Second thing I wanted to point out is that anyone who is registered for this webinar will receive a copy of the presentation as well as a recording, and we'll get that out to you sometime tomorrow. That way you'll have all the information. You don't have to take notes on each and every slide. You'll actually have that information in the next 24 hours or so. My name is Scott Brown. I'm with the Greenhouse Project. I've been with the Greenhouse Project now for about 3 years. And my primary role is working with organizations and individuals who are looking to learn more about the model. I work a lot with executive leadership teams and boards with the goal of really ascertaining that organization's needs and how they might align with a greenhouse homes. I've been in this space for about, almost 10 years now, and I've been working primarily on the vendor side with providers. My overall background is in executive leadership and management, operations, sales and marketing. So I have a pretty broad-based amount of experience that I bring to bear and sort of informs the way I look at things. And you'll get to hear a little bit about some of the things I've learned about the greenhouse model during the course of this presentation. So just to give you a sense of the agenda, I will provide a very brief background on the Greenhouse Project and the Greenhouse model. If you'd like to learn more about the Greenhouse model, we do a webinar devoted strictly to that. This will just be a quick recap to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Then we'll talk a little bit about the skilled nursing environment and the dynamics of it. I think it's really important to create context for our discussion. Part of the rationale behind the greenhouse model is not just dollars and cents, but it's also strategy. So to some extent, we've got to talk about how the greenhouse model is going to fit with things as they evolve. We'll get into the business case itself, and we'll talk about some numbers. And then we'll talk about what it's like to work with the Greenhouse Project, and I will answer any questions after that. So I'd like to begin. Oh, I see a note here from Maggie about hearing a bell sound and my voice cutting out. I think that's people as they enter the conference. So that should stop pretty shortly. So let's talk a little bit about the Greenhouse Project and where it came from. So the founder of the Greenhouse Project is a fellow by the name of Bill Thomas. Many of you may be familiar with him. He's very well known as both a gerontologist and a leader in what's called the culture change movement. But if you step back 30 years or so, he was a newly minted Harvard physician, and he returned to upstate New York, which is where he grew up, to practice medicine. And one of his first jobs was in a nursing home. And as he performed his rounds, he did his work, he was very efficient, handled it the way he was trained. And then one day he was called to check in on an elder who was complaining of a rash on her arm. So he went in and examined her and was writing an order for a cream, and he got up to leave. And the woman grabbed his arm really hard and looked up into his eyes and said, "I am so lonely." And that experience really began to shape how he saw things in the nursing home. And what he ultimately came to realize was that what was really afflicting the elders wasn't medical. It wasn't healthcare issues. It was really what he came to call the three plagues of loneliness, helplessness, and boredom. After working for a number of years in that role as medical director, he founded the Eden Alternative. And the Eden Alternative was really a pioneer in the culture change movement. And the goal was to try to replace an institutional mindset and institutional care, which is all geared towards tasks and the efficiency of the organization, with person-centered care. And a lot of people that have heard of the Eden Alternative and Bill Thomas associated with some of the things that he tried to do to help change nursing homes. That, so oftentimes they'll be associated with things like bringing more pets into the nursing home, plants, bringing children into the nursing home. So his goal ultimately was to try to mitigate that institutional frame and try to create a more home-like environment. I like to think of it as, sanding the sharp edges off of the nursing home environment. And after doing this for about 10 years and working with organizations, he realized two things. One was, there was limits to how much you could do in that traditional environment. And it wasn't just physical, well, that's a big piece of it. It was also how the organization was structured and the general philosophy of nursing homes. The other thing he realized was that nursing homes are really old and they're going to need to be replaced soon. And so what he did is he sat down with a blank sheet of paper and said, if I could design a nursing home from the ground up, what would it look like? And he actually said that the hardest part of that process was to scrub the institutional thinking out of his mind. So here's a guy that challenged the institutional mindset from the beginning, and he still found that institutional bias was still with him. So he created this model that he called the greenhouse model, and he founded the Greenhouse Project. The Greenhouse Project started through the help of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. They supplied a grant to create the organization, and they called it a National Replication Center. And the goal was to describe that greenhouse model, so take that idea and actually turn it into something that people could implement. A big part of what we do is promote the model, educate people like we're doing today. Also, we replicate it, so we are now working with organizations across the country to implement greenhouse model homes. We continue to focus on developing best practices and an evidence base. We've been doing this now for over 10 years, and every time we do a new project, we learn something new. And that gets added into our best practices and evidence base, and the next greenhouse adopter actually benefits from that. So people ask us what we do. We deliver services to develop greenhouse homes and create sustainable, deep culture change. So we're working with organizations that have a desire to bring greenhouse homes to their community, and we provide the service and the expertise to make that a reality. So what is the greenhouse model? Well, first of all, it replaces that traditional institutional nursing home with a small house or a small home. You'll hear people talk about small houses, and you'll hear people talk about greenhouses. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they're really not. Small house is sort of a broad category. It doesn't actually have a clear definition. Greenhouse is a subcategory, so it's like facial tissue and Kleenex. So that's really the difference. We're the Kleenex. The greenhouse model changes three things. What people think about most when they think about greenhouse is the architecture, that small house model. But we see that as only a third of it. The physical environment is not the be-all and end-all. In order to make the whole thing work, you need to change the philosophy of care, and also you need a different organizational structure. So all three of those things make the greenhouse model. One of the things about the model when it was developed was it was clear that it would have to work within the current regulations and reimbursement, which it does. If you have a greenhouse home that is certified for skilled nursing, it can provide all the same services as any nursing home and qualifies for the same reimbursement. The bottom line with the model is it improves quality of life for the elders living there as well as the staff working there. And we'll talk about that, both those things a little bit later. So you can distill down the greenhouse model to its core values. There's three of them: real home, meaningful life, and empowered staff. So what do we mean by these values? When we talk about real home, there's a few things about it. One is it's similar to the surrounding community. And so along the right-hand side of your screen, you can see photos of different greenhouse projects. The first one is in Grand Rapids, an organization called Porter Hills. It's a traditional cottage model. But you also see two other models that may not look so familiar. St. Martin's in the Pines, which is in Birmingham, Alabama, and at the bottom, the Leonard Florence Center for Living. The thing about each one of those projects is the community where they reside matches the architecture there. So at the bottom, Leonard Florence Center for Living is actually in an urban area, densely populated with people, where people live in multifamily homes, apartment buildings, and so forth. So that design works. In a more residential area like Grand Rapids, the cottage style is a good fit. And in Birmingham, this particular part of Birmingham is actually got a mix of single-family homes and some apartment and condo complexes. So you can see how that garden-style apartment works in that environment. So they're all similar to the surrounding community. They all have residential finishes. Each greenhouse home includes private rooms and baths for 10 to 12 elders. So those two photos at the bottom, there are actually multiple greenhouse homes within it. So in St. Martin's in the Pines, which is in the middle, there are actually 3 greenhouse homes. And down at the bottom, at the Leonard Florence Center for Living, there are actually 10 greenhouse homes spread over 5 floors, so 2 per floor. In every case, the homes themselves are where 10 to 12 elders live. Meals are prepared there in the home. There's actually a kitchen in every home, and that's where meals are prepared. And there's a real focus on intentional community. And a big piece of that is creating spaces which promote that. So the key part of this is a part of the home we call the hearth area. And the hearth area is composed of the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen. It may not be apparent from this picture, but if you look at the photo in the middle, which shows the dining room, you'll see there's one long table, and that's true of any greenhouse home. The idea there is to recreate that family experience. So there's actually a room at the table for every elder that lives there, plus the people that work there, and sometimes 1 or 2 guests. And the idea there is that elders may choose not to eat at that table. They can choose to eat wherever they like, but there's always a seat at the table for them. They're always included. There's always room. And these are the areas that really promote that intentional community. This is where people gather, spend time. As you can imagine, when meals are being prepared, there's a lot of attention given to the kitchen area. So this helps promote that idea of intentional community. The second core value is meaningful life. And when I say that to people, some respond, oh, you're just talking about person-centered care. And my answer is yes, and. It actually goes beyond person-centered care to person-directed care, and then even beyond that, to helping create a meaningful life for elders. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, when we talk about person-directed care, it means that people have the ability to make the decisions about how they live. And so we create as much, or we provide as much of the decision-making to the elders as is possible. So they can choose simple things like what time they get up, and what they might want for breakfast, for instance, how they spend their time, and so on. Those decisions, if you really think about it, we're sort of the sum total of the decisions we make. But if you take that away, you take away a lot of what makes a person an individual. We also see all people as creative, resourceful, and whole. So we don't focus on disability, we focus on abilities. We feel like there's still opportunities for everybody at every stage of life to actually be productive, to create value, to have engagement, and ultimately to create a life worth living. At no point does that stop. It is part of the human condition, and it's something that we support. And then the third core value is empowered staff. And we represent the greenhouse organization very differently. Instead of that hierarchical top-down approach, you can see we use this circular model. One of the key things is that the elder is always the center of our focus, and you'll see the elder actually on this organizational chart. The there's actually a realignment and redefinition of roles and responsibilities. It utilizes the versatile worker or universal worker role, and in order to really make this work, there's a radical change in leadership style. If you're empowering people, you're not directing them what to do. You're actually working with them collaboratively. So there's actually a coaching approach to leadership. So that's your quick overview of the greenhouse model. And as I said, there's another webinar where we go into much more depth about the model itself. Now what I'd like to do is sort of create some context for our conversation and talk about the dynamics of the skilled nursing environment. So the current state of skilled nursing is there are about 15,000 nursing homes. Most of them were built in the 1960s, plus or minus 10 years. If you go into them, they really all look the same. And that's because when they were built, they were modeled on what was the sort of the pinnacle of healthcare efficiency, which was a hospital. It's a very much a task-oriented. There are times for bathing, there are times for dining, there are times for socializing, and everything is sort of laid out. And that's that very focused sort of task-centered care as opposed to person-centered care. There's a lot of change in the healthcare landscape and really the rules affecting nursing homes. One of the big issues is the issue of money. We are in an environment where there's increasing cost of healthcare, there's increasing consumption of healthcare, all of which contributes to financial challenges for the country. We have, this is really being driven by demographic change. So the baby boomer generation, the silver tsunami, which is coming through. So there's that sort of demographic shift and change in the age of the average person in the U.S. Baby boomers also have characteristics that are unique, that were not part of their parents' generation. One of them is they want to keep control, they're independent, they want to make their own choices. The other thing we see is there is a growing focus on value. We'll talk a little bit about this idea that historically there's been a fee-for-service model, which means if a service is provided, the provider gets paid, no matter how many times they do it. And now there's a focus not on this sort of volume-based approach, but on an outcome or value-based approach. And then, of course, there's been healthcare reform, the Affordable Care Act, and that has started a change in the environment. Many of the changes, however, predated that. So there are a lot of things affecting the healthcare landscape, and then there's probably one more, which is this guy and the new administration that is going to focus on improving the Affordable Care Act. So we can expect to see a lot of changes as a result of that, and the Republican administration. So, it's funny, in the last 2 months, for the first time, I'm getting all these questions about what's going to happen, and I've actually spent a lot of time over the last, since December, really trying to get a better feel for what we can expect and how the changes will affect the greenhouse model. And I think what's helpful is to realize that there were some big things happening that truthfully go beyond a particular administration. One of them is generational change. It's this baby boomer generation. Those demographics are fixed. We know what's going to happen. There's not going to be a big change, and we know there's going to be a lot more people requiring skilled nursing care and other forms of care, and that those people will be different than the generation before. This growth in the number of people, as well as the growth in the cost of health care, contributes to issues with debt. So how much we have to pay for that, the percentage of our GDP that it represents, and that is really driving this focus on healthcare reform. Healthcare reform will continue in some way. The expectation should be that it will change from what it was during the Obama years, but there's still going to need to be a focus on addressing those other trends. So keep those in mind. Now let's talk more specifically about skilled nursing. And one of the things that anybody who has either been in the skilled nursing space or has an aging parent has heard is, whatever happens, please don't send me to a nursing home. Why is this? Well, because people say they want to stay home. Also, nursing homes don't have a great reputation. So this was a study that was done in 2005 by the Kaiser Family Foundation, and it basically asked consumers of these various healthcare providers, who do you think is doing a good job? And you can see nurses do great, doctors do well, hospitals do pretty well. And you can see that ultimately, when it comes to nursing homes, they do better than HMOs. That's about all we've got going for us right now. So that's a real challenge. We've got this perception of nursing facilities that isn't very positive. The other thing we got to keep in mind is, people say they want to be home. And so I'm sharing with you a strategy canvas. It's actually a tool from a book called Blue Ocean Strategies, published, I guess now about 10 years ago. And what it does is it suggests to organizations that are doing strategic planning to take a look at their industry, identify what are the key factors of competition. In other words, what do they compete with with others in the industry on, and really chart how they stack up versus how their competitors stack up. So the same approach was used by a graduate class at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Erickson School. And they did this for the senior living field. So you can see there's factors of competition along the bottom, and this yellow line here represents what everyone says they want, right? This is, people want to stay home. That's what they say. So that's what this looks like. And you can see the second line down is assisted living. And you can see that while it does all right, it's sort of a pale approximation of being home. And then at the bottom, you can see skilled nursing. So when people say, I want to stay home, they don't see a nursing home fulfilling any of that, really. So there's that huge gap between home and nursing home. So one of the things we're grappling with, as I mentioned, is demographic changes. And we see the aging of the baby boomers demographic. And you can see on this chart, based on those demographics, when the boomers are going to reach the age where they're actually going to need skilled nursing care. People don't need skilled nursing care when they're 65. The average age, I think, is actually 85 plus. So you can tell here that, while we're seeing some growth, there is the real boom happens not for another 8 or 10 years or so. But based on this, we should be seeing some increased demand even now, and we don't. Most areas of the country are seeing slackening demand or even declining demand. And even though the demographics suggest that shouldn't be the case, some things have changed over the last 20 or 30 years. One is there are more competitors. Assisted living really didn't exist 30 years ago. And so now that's an alternative for many elders. There's a lot of focus on keeping people as long as possible in the home by home and community-based services. So there are other competitors with skilled nursing that are affecting demand for skilled nursing beds. So this gives you a little bit of a sense of what's happening with skilled nursing utilization. This is a national chart. Your area could be very different, but nationally, occupancy rate is about 82%. That line that's about 2/3 of the way up represents current skilled nursing capacity. So there is this gap, and I ask people, what do they think that gap represents? And many of them say, well, it means that the occupancy in my nursing home is going to be down. And there's some truth in that, depending on the conditions, that yes. But I look at it and I think, that gap means something else. It really means that consumers have choices. So in many states, there's a certificate of need. And the certificate of need, the whole process was designed around the idea that there should be a match between supply and demand. So if you built a nursing home, historically, you could ensure that you were going to be pretty close to capacity because of that. What certificate of need didn't really take into account was the fact that there might be declining demand. And so what has happened now is that there is now this gap. So if you had a nursing home 30 years ago, you could be pretty sure you're going to stay fully occupied. Now you don't. So now what happens is people, if they need a nursing home, instead of having the choice of one nursing home, they might be able to choose from 5 or 10 because there's vacancies in all of them. So in my mind, this gap creates consumer choice. And that's something I think we as a field have not really grappled with, is really making our nursing homes better, making them appeal to consumers. Lest you get too concerned, the trend does actually improve. And as you see that curve and the demographic trend start trending upwards, you'll start seeing that demand will continue to go up. I actually think the chart in front of you is a little bit optimistic because I think that there will be a lot of other pressures keeping occupancy a little bit lower, but the trend itself will continue. Demographics demands it. It may be, for instance, a few more years before we hit 100% capacity than is demonstrated here. But it gives you a feel that there is a short-term issue, but the long-term prognosis and need is still going to be there. So we're going to see a lot more in the way of consumer choice. Baby boomers are going to demand it. The fact that there's excess capacity is going to be what makes it possible. The other thing is, when you hear about some of the proposals about health insurance, for instance, where there's larger deductibles, there's higher premiums and so on, that's all going to get consumers more involved in making decisions about their health care. And of course, the digital health technology. There's a lot more going to be available to people to manage their health than there was 10 years ago, for instance. So all that's going to drive more focus on consumers and consumer choice. So if consumers have a choice and you have a nursing home and it looks like everybody else, it's reasonable to expect you're going to get about the same occupancy as everybody else. So if your community has 82% occupancy, you're probably going to have about the same. The way to really change that, to really change your occupancy, is to really stand out. It's going to be really important to differentiate yourself from the competition. So think about how you can make that happen. So as I mentioned, I'm now getting questions about the future of healthcare, and I went to a couple of different conferences, and I've read a whole lot over the last 60 days or so. And what I came to realize was this, that anyone who tells you with perfect confidence what's going to happen is either bluffing or a fool. There's just too much uncertainty. So I prefer not to focus on a lot of the detail, but those mega trends we talked about. The other thing that I heard that I thought resonated with me, this was Tom Scully, who used to lead CMS. He basically said, don't bet against bureaucracy. Don't bet against inertia. It is very hard to do things. It is very hard to change things. And I think you're hearing a lot more discussion about that now than you did, for instance, 90 days ago, about the challenges of some of the changes that we're hearing about in healthcare. So these two things, I think, I'm holding on to right now. I mean, the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and really when we're talking about this, the focus has been on providing health insurance for individuals, which doesn't affect skilled nursing very much. So those kinds of changes will have nominal impact on the nursing home business. I still think what's going to happen is the Affordable Care Act, or at least what was described as the triple aim, will be unchanged. And when people talked about the Affordable Care Act, when it was designed, it was designed as something more than just an individual insurance mandate. It was designed as a way to achieve this triple aim of improving the experience of care, outcomes, and the per capita cost of health care. That's not going to change. Even the experience of care, which sounds a little squishy, right? That will continue to be an area of focus. One thing you need to know about healthcare is when the government talks about healthcare, they start with hospitals. And what's happening now with hospitals is there is a survey. The acronym is HCAHPS. And essentially, patients are rating their inpatient stay on 27 categories, and their reimbursement from Medicare is actually affected by the results. The same kind of survey process is going to be applied to skilled nursing. So the consumer experience is going to continue to be important, and in very short order, there's going to be a financial impact. Payment reform, which will continue to link payments to outcomes as opposed to a fee-for-service. There's still a lot going on. Accountable care organizations are still very popular. There are still a lot of accelerated payment reform in programs, all of which is really designed towards creating coordinated care, excellent outcomes, safe care transitions, and a real area of focus has been this idea of hospitalization rates. How do you reduce rehospitalization rates or focus on an unnecessary rehospitalization? This is happening. I mean, this isn't about to happen. It is happening. This is a press release from CMS. You can see that 50% of payments will be tied to these alternate payment models by 2018. Why is there a focus on rehospitalizations? Well, because between 1/3 and 2/3 can be avoided. So that is wasted cost. Also, it is very stressful, particularly in a nursing home environment, to take an elder, transmit them to the hospital through the emergency room. It's extremely stressful and disorienting. So there's both a human cost as well as this financial cost. And the interesting thing is that there's penalties associated with this. Once again, hospitals have already felt this. Same thing is going to apply to skilled nursing beginning in 2019. So here's the interesting thing about this. It's working. This is actually a headline from McKnight's from Thursday of last week. CMS reports sharp drop in avoidable hospitalizations among long-term care residents. So this approach is actually working. So you can expect that this will continue to be an area of focus for CMS as a way to reduce costs. Another demographic trend we don't focus as much on is caregiver availability. So the chart you see in front of you shows these two bars. One is working age population, 18 to 64, for each person 85 and older. So those are the folks that are in nursing homes. And what you can see is the availability of caregivers is actually declining over time relative to the number of people 85 and older. So there's going to be a real challenge in terms of attracting and retaining caregivers. So when we think about nursing homes and thinking about the need for care, we've got to really think about the fact that we need to find the best caregivers and then find a way to hold on to them, because it's going to be increasingly a challenge to do so, and it's going to be increasingly difficult to replace them. So just keep in mind the key trends. Demographics, those baby boomers, the fact there's going to be consumer choice. There's going to continue to be a focus on value and outcomes in terms of payments, and that attracting and retaining direct care staff is going to be critically important in the years ahead. So now what I'd like to do is talk more specifically about greenhouse homes and talk about the urban legend. And of course, you know, an urban legend is something that people have heard about and talk about, but no one has ever seen. And a good example is there's alligators in the sewers, right? people talk about it like it's happened, but you'll never meet anybody who's actually seen it. It's going to be the brother's uncle's brother-in-law's sister that is reported seeing it. So what is the urban legend about greenhouse homes? It's pretty simple. It doesn't work financially. And we hear this all the time. And so what I want to do is just put right out there, this is a study that was done in the Seniors Housing and Care Journal about the financial impact of greenhouse homes. And it goes on to state that the operating costs are comparable to traditional nursing homes, that people who operate greenhouse homes experience occupancy increases. They have the ability to actually get more people attending who pay privately. They're able to increase the rates that people paying privately pay. And there are increases in Medicare, basically in getting rehabilitative work in greenhouse homes. So if you look at this, kind of to sum it up, your operating costs are comparable, and there's a revenue upside. This is the reality, and it's consistent with the experience of greenhouse homes all across the country. So the fact is that the greenhouse model is not only financially viable, but generates a good return. So I want to give you a little bit more background on operating greenhouse homes and talk a little bit more about how these results are achieved. So a couple of years ago, we did a survey of operating greenhouse homes, and the goal was to verify or validate some of our assumptions that we use when we do financial analysis with our clients. We have a financial feasibility modeling service that we offer. We want to make sure the assumptions were correct. So in particular, we wanted to get a sense of what the costs were to build and how people were actually funding or financing greenhouse homes. And we wanted to get a sense of, what was happening in terms of revenue. So what did we learn? We know that 80% of greenhouse homes are licensed to skilled nursing. About 20% are assisted living and other. Historically, the vast majority of greenhouse homes have been nonprofit, and you'll see in some of the results that the financing options reflect some of that. We're actually seeing a little bit of an uptick on the for-profit side. We have some entrepreneurial organizations that are developing startups as for-profits in various places across the country. So we're seeing more interest in this from the for-profit space who see sort of the strategic value of the greenhouse model.
Hello?
Yes.
Can anyone hear?
Sorry?
I'm sorry, folks. Apparently, I accidentally hit my mute button. I apologize for that. So I'm not sure exactly where I dropped off. So I'm going to start with the greenhouse survey. When we did our survey, we found that the average occupancy in greenhouse homes was 98%. We found that organizations actually were getting a pretty wide range of payments for the greenhouse homes, everywhere from $178. That was an organization that felt that because of their mission, they couldn't charge more for private pay than they got from Medicaid, up to $500 a day, which represents a premium of 0 to 55%. And 42% of the elders in greenhouse homes are on Medicaid. So another thing we used to hear was you can't operate greenhouse homes with Medicaid. And that's actually not true. 42% of the elders are in greenhouse homes, so you can both fulfill your mission and get a good return on your investment. When it comes to the cost of building, the variables are pretty broad. Where you're building has a huge impact on cost. So the project on the top of your screen is in Dandridge, Tennessee, and you've probably never heard of it because it's in a very rural area. The cost to build there are quite a bit different than the project at the bottom of the screen, which is in Seward, Alaska. In Alaska, you actually need to ship or truck in all of your materials. So it's a very costly place to build. Along the right-hand side, that might appear to be a fairly traditional project, which in some regards it is, but it's also located in a suburb of New York City, which is a very expensive place to build. Those nice trees actually had to be preserved, which was costly, and there was a fair amount of site work. So all those things contributed to a fairly high cost to build. It really will depend on what you're building. Are you building a 10-bed home versus 12? That'll increase the size, which will increase the cost per home. Are you building in an urban area, that multi-story? Because multi-story is actually more expensive to build versus a single family. And are you looking for things like a LEED certification to make it more energy efficient? All of those things contribute to the cost, which in our survey ranged from $166, which is Dandridge, Tennessee, per square foot, up to over $500. The project in the upper left-hand side is a rendering. It's the new Jewish home in Manhattan. It's on the Upper West Side. It's a high-rise. They should be breaking ground fairly shortly. But as you can imagine, that is a very expensive project. In fact, it's a $300 million project. It'll include 22 greenhouse homes in addition to a lot of other office space and other facilities. It will be the largest project capital project devoted to seniors in the history of the state of New York. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see the greenhouse home in Porter Hills. That's the one that's Silver LEED certified. When it comes to financing greenhouse homes, we've seen a lot of changes. Right now, there's a lot more organizations are getting conventional loans. So it's relatively easy to get low-interest loans from local banks, for instance. So conventional loans are quite popular. Organizations that are in rural areas can oftentimes leverage a USDA to get very attractive long-term debt at a low interest rate. And then for some of the nonprofits, they have also been able to use tax-exempt bonds. Obviously, if you're a nonprofit, the ability to do fundraising is helpful. And then ultimately, when it comes to debt, it's just like your home mortgage. You know, if you have a good credit rating, you're going to be able to, have access to more and better options. And the same is true in this space too. So if you have efficient operations, you have a good payer mix, and you have reasonable development costs, that's going to make it easier for you to acquire capital at an attractive rate. So I want to talk a little bit about what it is that helps these greenhouse homes operate at a competitive cost to traditional nursing homes. And one of the things that we're going to address has been the issue of economies of scale. We're kind of all geared, or we're trained to think about economies of scale, and there are actually lots of stories of organizations that have gotten too big. So economies of scale isn't always the answer to every question. In the greenhouse model, we do a couple of things. One is we actually increase the direct care staffing. We accompany that with a reduction in non-direct care staffing. So you're actually putting your staffing investment where it really helps elders, helps you with outcomes. What this is essentially doing is you're shifting your costs. And you're creating a model that is much more flexible and efficient than you would see in a traditional nursing home. So this is a fairly traditional hierarchical nursing home organization. And you can get a sense of how it works just by looking at it. You know who's in charge, that's the administrator. You know who has the least power, that's the CNA. And you know if somebody wants to make a decision, they've got to run it up the chain. And if you think about that, every time you run an idea or a decision up the chain, there's time, energy, and effort involved in it. And then, God forbid, you should have to actually, go from your silo to the next silo. There can also be challenges there. So this model would not work in a greenhouse home. So we have this organizational model that I showed you earlier, which is a circular model. So you've got at the center the elder, which you don't see in the hierarchical depiction of greenhouse organizations. Around the elder, these S's actually represent a position called a shabazz, or the plural is shabazim. And I know that's a strange sounding word. Those are the universal workers. And the name comes from a Persian fable. And it really, without getting into a lot of detail, in the fable, the shabazz referred to the king's falcon that was responsible for keeping a watch over the city or the kingdom. And so that's where the name comes from. But part of it is that words have power and they have meaning. And what we want to do is we want to change that traditional mindset of this is only a CNA. In this model, the shabazz role is really revered, and it's revered for the relationships and the depth of knowledge the shabazim accumulate about the elders. So that's that role. Up on the top, you see the clinical support team. The shabazim report to and are held accountable by a position called a guide, which in some cases can be an administrator, but doesn't always have to be. Essentially, the guide is responsible for holding the shabazim accountable and for achieving results in the home. They're also there to help facilitate. So if there's challenges and so on, the guide helps deal with that. You will still see a director of nursing. The nurses report to the director of nursing. So those are sort of the key positions in the greenhouse organization. I mentioned earlier this whole idea of a versatile worker. So the Shabazim, in addition to providing direct care, they do housekeeping, laundry, they do the cooking. So I mentioned earlier that meals are prepared in the kitchen, in the home. The Shabazim do that. And they're responsible for activity and all the life in the home. The Shabaz position, because it's empowered, they can actually organize instantaneously to best meet the needs of elders. So, you know, if someone, if an elder needs help getting to a room, a person can do that, the other person can cook. They coordinate everything they do, and they can respond instantaneously to what's going on in the home. They don't need to ask for permission to change their schedule. The other thing about this is there's a great deal of continuity in the staffing. They spend a lot of time around the elders, and so as a result, there's a real relationship focus. So the Shabazim really get to know elders very well. And as I mentioned earlier, that's actually one of the areas they're respected, is because they have that knowledge and those relationships with the elders. Shabazim work in a self-managed work team, and lest you think that that's anarchy, for every greenhouse home, there are 5 coordinator positions, and the coordinator is responsible for everything like housekeeping and culinary and things like that. They kind of stay on top of everything. And the Shabazim still have all those same responsibilities they would have in a nursing home in terms of fulfilling their service, their direct care needs, and so on. The thing about it is that a lot of people worry that there's no accountability. And I'm just going to give you a small example. It was actually, I was at a greenhouse home, and we were talking with a group of Shabazim, and somebody in the group actually asked a question like that. It sounds like it's anarchy. And a young woman who was, had been a Shabaz for about 6 months said, oh no, let me give you a small example of what it's like. She said, well, I was a housekeeping coordinator, and it was my job to order cleaning supplies for the house, and I forgot to do it. And in the greenhouse model, I know that it was my responsibility. There's no one else I can blame it on. And everyone on my team knew it was my responsibility. So I'm 100% accountable for that. And that's just one example, but there's lots of ways to create accountability that don't require, a heavy-handed, directed approach. So this is a representation of staffing in greenhouse homes, and you can see there's a big change. There is a much higher proportion of the CNA Shabaz role. Nursing is slightly higher, but you see a dramatic reduction in some of the other areas you would expect, like laundry, housekeeping, and dietary, activities, and so on. So you do see this is where that cost shifting comes in. So you're investing your money in direct care staffing and less in some of the other overhead areas. In case you're curious, when it comes to direct care staffing, in a 10-bed home, there are actually 2 Shabazim days and evenings and 1 overnight. In terms of nursing, there's 1 nurse for 2 houses during the days and 1 nurse for 2 to 3 houses evenings and nights. So that gives you a feel for what that's like. This is another way to take a look at how the staffing in greenhouse homes looks. And you can see once again that, the CNA role, which is the Shabaz in the greenhouse model, is much higher than you see in a traditional. You see slightly higher in terms of nursing, but you see a lot of reductions in some of the other areas. So this represents that whole idea of cost shifting that I mentioned earlier. And this is what helps the model be comparable in terms of operating costs to a traditional nursing home, this flattening of the hierarchy. So I've given you a lot of general information about the greenhouse model, a lot of averages and so on, and I wanted to give you a specific case study. This is for a project that's up in Rochester, New York. It'll help change your perspective on economies of scale forever. So this particular project, there are 2 greenhouse homes. They're 2 10-bed greenhouse homes. They're actually built as part of a market rate housing development. They're in a community, in a neighborhood, about 10 miles away from the Legacy Nursing Home. That's the traditional nursing home, sometimes referred to as the mothership. So the Legacy building has 450 skilled nursing beds, and these 2 greenhouse homes represent 20 beds. So big variance. That Legacy building should have every advantage when it comes to economies of scale. These greenhouse homes opened in 2011. So we'll give you a feel for specifics on a project. These homes were actually a little bit bigger than we would typically see for 10-bed greenhouse homes, largely because they have larger bedrooms. And that was driven by some stakeholder focus groups they did, and they spoke to elders. And the elders wanted bigger rooms and bigger beds, so they didn't want the hospital beds. So in these homes, there are actually full-size beds. So like I said, 8,300 square feet, we would typically think that a greenhouse home for 10 elders would be somewhere on the order of much closer to 7,000 square feet. The cost for this particular project was $210 a square foot. The lion's share of the financing was through conventional loans, and it was augmented by some fundraising. The Legacy Nursing Home actually has great results. You can see the occupancy is 96%. The greenhouse home has essentially been at 100% since it's been opened. And the Legacy Nursing Home, the payer mix is different. So Legacy has a Medicare component, so they do short-term rehab. The greenhouse homes do not. It's all long stay, so it's just a mix of Medicaid and private pay. So this is what's kind of mind-blowing. The Legacy Nursing Home, the variable costs per elder per day are $300. The greenhouse home is $210 per day. So huge, huge variation. I mean, that's really significant. And lest you think that these results are being done at the expense of outcomes or quality, what we find is this, that that's actually not the case. While their Legacy Nursing Home is incredibly well respected, it's a 5-star facility, they have really positive results, but greenhouse homes still outpace them in terms of clinical outcomes. So, when we talk about economies of scale and cost of operations, the greenhouse homes compete with traditional nursing homes, even in some cases outperform. But the model itself, because of the changes in the organizational structure, can in fact be very, very efficient to run and deliver great quality care. So I want to talk about some of the research that's been done with the greenhouse model. I want to talk a little bit first about some research we've done with what we call informal caregivers, and then we'll talk a little bit about academic research. So back in 2011, we spoke to about 1,100 what we called informal caregivers, and this was typically the son or daughter of someone who is at a point where they might need skilled nursing care. And so what we did is we described the greenhouse model to them, and about how there's a low ratio of elders to staff, that the architecture itself is laid out like a home, that they are small sized, and that there's a lot of advanced staff training. You might not be surprised to learn that, for instance, to be a Shabazz requires quite a bit of additional training, about 128 additional hours over and above the CNA certification. So we described it to them, and then we asked them, if you could have your loved one in greenhouse homes, would you be willing to pay more? And 60% of the caregivers would be willing to pay more. we asked them, if you could have your loved one in a greenhouse home, would you be willing to drive further? And 75% of them said they would be willing to drive further. So, this helps explain the fact that, we're seeing this very high national occupancy of 98%. It really is preferred. So consumers prefer it, and given a choice, this is what they would choose for the loved one. The greenhouse model is actually the only culture change model that has been subjected to academic research. So some of the research has shown that in the greenhouse model, you see improved quality of resident life, you see improved quality of care, and improved family satisfaction. As I mentioned earlier, you also see more direct care time. In fact, that higher direct care time and the staffing model increases engagement with elders. There's 4 times as much engagement with elders in a greenhouse home as there is in a traditional nursing home. And we see improved care outcomes. So people prefer it, higher satisfaction, better outcomes. And in fact, when you think about the challenge the government has and Medicare, for instance, in terms of improving outcomes and reducing costs, the greenhouse model actually supports that. So in a study that was done by David Grabowski, who's with Harvard, he found that greenhouse homes had lower instances of pressure ulcers, that there were 30 to 75% fewer hospitalizations than the national average. Think about that. That mirrors the 30 to 75% unnecessary rehospitalization rate from that other study. And that when everything is said and done, it actually saves the system, so Medicare, $10,000 per elder per year. Think about that. That is a huge amount of money and would make a huge impact on our national debt, and is a great argument to make with referral sources as well. So we talked a little bit about the workforce earlier, and the academic research we did also covered that. And what we found was that in greenhouse homes, there was actually improved staff satisfaction and less stress. And to me, this is a little bit surprising at first, because I think that it's easy to see that in many regards, being a Shabazz, for instance, is a more challenging role. More decision-making, more responsibility, more accountability. But I realized something really important, which is that in this business, the real focus is on creating engagement. We talk about that all the time because engagement is related to all sorts of positives like retention, outcomes, and so on. This model really promotes engagement. In fact, you can't do it unless you're fully engaged. So we also see greenhouse staff reporting increased likelihood of remaining in their jobs. What we hear over and over again is, I would never go back to doing it the old way. So the model actually has a real positive impact on the workforce. So something else that I like to talk about is the fact that when the greenhouse model was conceived, it was really conceived as a long-term care model, long stay. And in 2009, we had a project, the Leonard Florence Center for Living, that when they did their financials, they needed to include short-term rehab. And we agreed to it, but we weren't exactly sure how the model would work for short-term rehab. And it turns out that greenhouse homes are a great place to do rehab. Why is it? Well, because you're trying to prepare people to go home, and what better place to do that than in a place that feels like a real home? So other positives include the private rooms and private bathrooms, the home-cooked meal, the ability to get outside. There's no big therapy gyms in greenhouse homes. They do a lot of their work in and around the house. So, that's not a requirement for getting great rehab outcomes. And just to give you a sense, the Leonard Florence Center for Living, their length of stay is now down to 13 days. They continue to have a very low rehospitalization rate, below 10%. And we see this replicated over and over again. We have a project down in Florida, John Knox Village, which is getting really outstanding rehab numbers as well, and I hope to be sharing that in a later webinar. The other thing that we need to keep in mind when it comes to really anything in senior living, but we're thinking about it when it comes to greenhouse model, is the need for memory care. And there is going to be explosive growth in the number of instances of Alzheimer's here in the U.S. and worldwide. And right now, there really aren't the kind of quality places for people suffering with more significant forms of dementia. So when we look at memory care and dementia in the greenhouse model, we think about what we call the power of normal. And you can get a sense of this from this photo. If you take a look at the picture of the woman, you can get a sense of who she is, what she's interested in. She's obviously relaxing, reading. She has an interest in Asian art. It's a very serene environment, and you get a sense of who she is as a person. Well, which you're probably not aware of is the fact that this woman actually is very advanced dementia. And in the greenhouse model, we find two things. One is we see people differently because we get to know them as individuals. And the other thing, too, is that they respond to the power of real home. So during the research that has been done, we learned that 85% of the elders living in greenhouse homes are living with some form of dementia, which is very consistent with the national numbers. So there's nothing unique about what's happening in greenhouse homes. And we've historically always seen a positive response with elders who are suffering from memory care issues. We've seen lower levels of depression. They're less likely to be hospitalized. There's fewer instances of disruptive elder behavior, and we see that reduction in the use of antipsychotic or anti-anxiety drugs. So the greenhouse environment has always created a good place for elders suffering from memory care issues. However, we've decided to focus on raising our game and to really concentrate our effort on caring for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. So we are in the process of introducing a new program that is specifically for organizations who either have greenhouse homes or who are developing greenhouse homes. It's called Best Life. This is our memory care program. The thing about this program is it is designed specifically to align with all the greenhouse core values we talked about: meaningful life, empowered staff, and real home. It's not just a training program. It's meant to really continue this focus on culture and creating meaningful engagement, and focus as well on health and wellness. The program itself is a 5-day training program. There's 4 days of on-site training and a 1-day train the trainer. So the idea is that when you go through this program, you'll have educators who are trained to continue to deliver updates, train new employees, and so on your campus. In addition, there's ongoing support like monthly webinars. We're going to collect metrics about the results. You'll have access to a dementia care expert and so on. So it is really meant to continue that legacy of providing deep transformational culture change and applying it now to the memory care space. Some of the key concepts that we touch on in Best Life is beyond that power of normal I mentioned, is focusing on retained abilities. So not focus on disabilities, but focus on retained abilities. We talk about risk and how important risk is in maintaining dignity. Another area we focus on is the idea of age-appropriate interactions. I keep on being reminded, if you've seen Benjamin Button, as he approaches the end of his life and he's aging in reverse, so he's getting younger, there was that sort of infanthood was when he was actually having dementia. There's this idea that people with dementia are somehow like children. and that's not the case. They're adults, and they need to be treated as such. The idea here is to take this greenhouse environment that has had such a positive impact on people suffering from memory care issues and really take it to the next level. So this is a program we'll be talking much more about in the months to come. And as I said, it's specific to organizations that are implementing the greenhouse model. So when we think about the business case for the greenhouse model, there's some things to keep in mind we talked about. That it's a differentiated model, it's preferred by consumers, improves the experience of care, quality of care, it reduces cost for payers. The operating costs, it's not more expensive to run than a traditional nursing home, it's competitive. There's a favorable occupancy and payer mix, so there's positives on the revenue side. That whole issue of attracting and retaining staff is important now and become increasingly important, is impacted by the greenhouse model. And you can get great short-term rehab and memory care outcomes with the greenhouse model as well. So let's talk about working with the greenhouse model, a greenhouse project, excuse me. When you work with a greenhouse model, you become part of, this group of people across the country that are being recognized by media outlets everywhere. And this is just a sampling of some of the media coverage we've received. One of my favorites is actually that NPR story, which aired now a couple of years ago, and it was on the radio show. We get about 5,000 hits on our website a month. We got 5,000 in 24 hours, crashed our website. It was all consumers looking for greenhouse homes for their loved ones. So there's a huge demand for greenhouse homes, and it's really up to us to find a way to increase the supply. When you work with the greenhouse project, we break the process down into phases. Right now we're in phase 1, which is information gathering. You're learning more about the greenhouse model. You probably continue, but this is where you get a sense of what it's all about, and perhaps we'll have a conversation and have further discussion about it. Information gathering. Second phase is financial feasibility. We actually offer to people interested in exploring the greenhouse model a financial feasibility modeling service. We actually work with organizations to use their numbers, their local numbers, to put together a financial feasibility model that will give them 10 years of P&Ls for their project. And the rationale is pretty simple. People do research, they really like it, and then they say, well, can we afford to do this? Or, of course, doing a financial feasibility and having a business plan is going to be part of taking something to a board or to an executive leadership team or looking for financing. So it's really important to have that as part of the process. Once you decide to move ahead, you enter phase 3, which is what we call discovery. This is what takes you from, yes, I want to move forward, up to your groundbreaking. So the key areas of focus are on architecture. So we work with your architects to ensure that they're benefiting from everything we've learned about developing greenhouse homes over the years, best practices. They get access to our design guide and so on. We work with regulators. Greenhouse model, while it fits within all the regulations, we sometimes need to educate and translate for various regulators to help them understand how the greenhouse model actually meets or exceeds all the intentions of all the regulations and life safety codes. And of course, we start with also training the leadership team and getting them on board, because we find that ultimately the success of greenhouse homes is really driven by the understanding and commitment of that leadership team. Phase 4 is creating home. That begins at groundbreaking and takes you through to your opening and beyond. There the focus is on training and education, really getting people up to speed on the greenhouse philosophy and approach, helping them learn skills that will help them be successful in their roles and so on. We also work on things like policies and procedures. Everything we're doing at that stage is really geared towards having a successful opening. And then once you open, we get to phase 5, which is sustaining home. that's ensuring that your greenhouse homes continue to be successful to achieve the kind of return you're looking for, both from a mission perspective as well as a financial perspective on into the future. So when you think about the greenhouse model and what it can bring to your organization, we break it down and we look at it in these buckets. There's brand, the kind of reputation the greenhouse model has, the attention it gets from the media, the fact that it's supported by research, and there is documented consumer demand for the model. We think about all the education and training you get, so leadership development, all the issues around change management, helping organizations move from a more institutional approach to the greenhouse model is not easy. If we were on television, we'd say, these are professionals to make this happen. You don't want to do it at home. Team management. You're working in a different model that requires teamwork, collaboration. How do you ensure that that happens? And then, of course, skills development, things like culinary training, for instance. Those are all covered in education and training. Then, of course, project management and consultation. This is really where you benefit from what we know about implementing greenhouse homes. So it's working with regulators and being able to share with them not just what's happening in your state, what's happening in 29 other states or 30 other states across the country. We work with your architects, share best practices. We help develop policies and procedures. So since greenhouse homes work in a very different way, the policies and procedures have to be different as well. And of course, you learn from all the best practices we gathered over 10 plus years. And then I mentioned that sustaining home at phase 5, that's where the peer network comes in. What we do is we actually you become a part of greenhouse adopters all across the country. So you have the ability to learn from, share with everyone. So if there's a challenge you're having, chances are there's a greenhouse home somewhere in the country that's dealt with it already. We do ongoing support. We provide educational tools, monthly webinars, and so on to ensure that you continue to keep up to date on everything that's happening in the greenhouse world. And of course, we put on an annual conference that is attended by greenhouse organizations across the entire country. So these are the things that come along with working with the Greenhouse Project. So at this point, we have a great deal of momentum. There are greenhouse homes across the nation in 30 states so far. There are 212 homes. And we have more than 150 in development, which will open up 6 additional states. So the hope is in the next couple of years, we'll be in 36 states and have as many as 400 greenhouse homes open. So with that, I'd like to take any questions you might have. As I mentioned, please feel free to use the chat box in the lower right-hand corner, and I'm happy to respond. So I have a question here from Mary Jones. I'm just scrolling through it. And the first question, as I understand it, is it addresses the concern about the level of savings that baby boomers have versus their parents. And Mary, the way we see this, at least in the short run, is that in every community there are still opportunities to identify people who actually do have the savings to pay privately. You know, to put things in perspective, you know, there's something like 2,200 greenhouse home beds in a sea of 1.5 million traditional nursing home beds. So at this point, you know, you still have the ability to attract, you know, private pay, even if it's a pretty small percentage of the population in a particular area. Your second question is, what happens when the baby boomers age out? Well, it's going to be a long time. So I think you know, you're thinking a little bit too far ahead. And I still feel like that if you have a better option, you know, when we get back to the case where I mentioned we're in now, where there's more choice, as long as you have an offering that is more attractive, you'll do better than the average provider of skilled nursing care. And then the third question is a question about people who are mentally handicapped and whether they're greenhouse homes for them. There are not yet. We are actually having conversations with a couple of organizations that are looking at developing them, but it's still pretty early stages. But as of today, there are no greenhouse homes that have been developed specifically for individuals with mental disabilities. I have a question here from Deepa Gupta, who lives in San Francisco and wants to start greenhouse homes in the city. Deepa, for you or anybody who's looking to do a startup, I typically suggest there are three things to consider. One is the regulatory environment in your state. In other words, in many states there's a certificate of need process, and the question is, if that's the case, what is that process? How long does it take? Or is there a moratorium in your state that will prevent you from building new nursing home beds? And in many states, that's an issue. So that would be the first thing to take a look at, because without that, it doesn't give you access to the same reimbursement sources, which will make things very difficult. The second issue, and you've addressed this, you have experience as a nursing home administrator, so that's a great help. And then the third piece, obviously, is going to be money. And you know, there's lots of different ways to address this, but one of the things that any startup is going to have to do is be really focused on addressing or finding ways to capture capital, whether it's as a nonprofit and doing fundraising, whether it's securing loans or finding investors. So those are sort of the three legs of the stool you need to get started. And I realize I'm being pretty general, but if you'd like to reach out to me, I'm going to put my contact information on the screen, and feel free, you can reach out to me, and I'd be happy to discuss it with you in more detail. Lynn has a question about whether an individual can own a house within the community. Lynn, I'm not sure I understand your question. Greenhouse homes are developed typically as part of a group. We would never recommend somebody develop a single greenhouse home because you still have sort of overhead costs you have to spread. For instance, you need an administrator, and there are lots of other elements of it as well. So I'm not sure if that's your question or something different, but actually, why don't you either shoot me another chat note or reach out to me after the webinar. Jenny Rowe has a question about whether we've worked with organizations that have renovated traditional nursing homes into greenhouse homes versus building new. We have worked with some organizations. I was at one yesterday, the New Jewish Home, which is down in Mamaroneck, New York, has done renovation for their nursing home. So it is possible. It is very difficult and oftentimes much more expensive, particularly if you have access to land. If you're landlocked, obviously that's not an option. And depending on, the rules around zoning in your community. But many organizations have looked at it, and most have decided to develop from the ground up, just because it's very hard to convert a traditional nursing home and make it feel like a real home. And for a whole variety of reasons, plus you're doing things like creating private rooms with private baths. That's a big, big renovation job for an existing nursing home. So it is extremely rare, often discussed, and as I said, as you sort of get into a cost benefit of it, it's oftentimes less expensive to build from scratch. Ron has a question about maybe interning at a greenhouse homes. Ron, what you could do is take a look at our website. There's a list of all the greenhouse homes, including the ones in Texas. And there's nothing in Houston, but there may be others that would make some sense for you. And reach out to them directly. Each greenhouse project is owned and operated by another organization, so that would be the best way to reach out. And if you have a challenge, feel free to shoot me a note, and I can try to get you a contact there. I have a question here from John Robinson. In the suburban model, how much per home can typically be spent before reaching the financial feasibility tipping point without subsidy? Does the urban model work only with grants and fundraising? Is there an example of an urban greenhouse that didn't require this kind of subsidy? Boy, those are complicated questions, John. Hard to respond to in a short period of time. So the question about the suburban model, your focus on the cost of the home itself, it also depends on the revenue and the cost of labor. So it's hard to come up with that. There are organizations who are able to do, spend more on homes, but because of the revenue opportunity, so there's not a fixed number I can give you. It's quite variable, and also has to take into account costs as well. So labor costs, for instance. So I can't give you a specific number there. The urban model, does it only work with grants or fundraising? Is there an example of an urban greenhouse that didn't require this kind of subsidy? Well, at this point, there's only 2 of them. So it's kind of the law of small numbers. So at this point, both the greenhouse homes that have been developed in urban areas have in fact been with nonprofits. But when you think about the fact that most of our projects are nonprofit, that wouldn't be surprising. But it obviously makes it easier. And in urban areas, land costs are high, building costs are high. So, it's not just a greenhouse home, but anyone looking to develop a nursing home in an urban area would experience these same kind of challenges, unless you're in an urban area that's perhaps, struggling a bit more. So I think that there are opportunities to build in urban areas. It would be very difficult, for instance, to replicate what was done on the Upper West Side of Manhattan without grant funding. Deepa has another question about information relating to Mount San Antonio Gardens experience in Southern California. Deepa, I don't have any like a written description of what goes on there. I would be happy to talk to you. California is very difficult. And in fact, they are in the process of passing small house regulations. Now, they've been in the process of passing these for about 3 years now. So at this point, it is near impossible to develop small house model of any kind, including greenhouse homes, and which is why there hasn't been anything since Mount San Antonio Gardens. So right now, there is a challenge in California specifically, one that we don't see in other states, around the development of greenhouse homes. So once again, I'd be happy to talk to you more about that if you want to shoot me a note. I have some availability later this week. Mary has a question about the USDA program that helps fund greenhouse homes in rural communities. I don't know what the specific name is, Mary. The USDA has a variety of loan programs and that are available to people living in rural communities. It would just make sense for you to Google that and learn some more. I'm sorry, I can't be more specific. All right then, it's about 2:30. I want to thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. I hope you found this valuable, and my apologies for the technical problem I had. Please feel free to reach out to me with any additional questions you might have. My contact information is right there. Thank you and have a great day.